So an important part of the disclosures in S2 is asking for information about an entity's Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And to do that, typically S2 asks a company to use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And that's because the board found that that is the most commonly used measurement framework around the world. It's not the only one though. So I say it's typically required to be used. There's a couple of exceptions. The first is in the first year that a company uses S2. If they were previously using a framework other than the GHG protocol framework, they can continue to use that for the first year. And the second exception is that if you're in a jurisdiction where you're required to use a different approach for regulatory purposes, for example, in your jurisdiction, to reduce the risk of duplication in reporting, in that specific scenario, an entity is permitted to use that other measurement approach. But for most, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is what applies, and so that's what I'm going to talk about now. So in S2, we ask for companies to consider all 15 categories of Scope 3 emissions that are set out in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and to determine which of those is important to provide material information for the entity's investors. So you have to think about all 15 categories, but you may conclude that only some of those 15 categories are applicable to provide material information. Irrespective of whether you use the GHG protocol or another measurement approach, you need to describe which of the 15 categories you are including in your measurement of your Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. So that's an important thing to know. The second thing to know is that we ask for information about the approaches to estimation and measurement of a company's greenhouse gas emissions. It's important to provide that information. So there's important disclosures that accompany the provision of a company's greenhouse gas emission information, including disaggregation of your Scope 1 and 2 emissions between those applicable to your consolidated accounting group and those applicable to other investees. We understand that measuring greenhouse gas emissions is not a straightforward task for companies, so there's several specific reliefs provided in our standards to assist companies in this process. One important relief is in relation to the value chain. We know that it takes time for a company to understand its value chain and to identify the parts of its value chain it needs to consider when it measures its Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions and determines which of the 15 categories it needs to report on. Reflecting this, we don't require that a company reassesses or reconsiders its value chain every reporting period. Rather, that exercise is limited to circumstances where there's evidence that a company would expect there to have been a potential change in the value chain, either because of something it has done, such as an acquisition, or as a result of third-party activities. If, for example, it knows that one of its suppliers has changed the way it operates its business and it might affect its emissions. In those circumstances, an entity needs to think about its value chain afresh, but not every period. Another important relief that's included in relation to the measurement of greenhouse gas emissions across scopes is in relation to other investees that are part of your value chain. Here we allow that if say a subsidiary of yours has got a different reporting date to yours and they have measured their greenhouse gas emissions and you want to use that information in preparing your consolidated greenhouse gas emission information, we allow the parent to use its subsidiary's information even if the reporting periods do not line up, as long as they are for the same duration. What do I mean? Let's assume that I've got a subsidiary who has a calendar year end and the parent has a March year end. The parent could use the December annual year end information of its subsidiary as part of its March annual year end greenhouse gas emissions for its consolidated calculations as a form of relief. This is important because it means you don't have to ask the subsidiary in that fact pattern to redo the numbers just to support the consolidation exercise. So that's a very important practical relief that the board decided to include specifically in S2.